Welcome to Entrepreneurship 101. This is preparation for the first session of 10-session Entrepreneurship Fundamentals course taught at Rice University. We do these video pre-lectures so that we can spend our time in the classroom doing and practicing entrepreneurship rather than lecturing on it. Entrepreneurship, like leadership and many other fields, can't really be learned from a textbook. It really has to be developed experientially. But let's back up first and, why do we even have a course on entrepreneurship? I mean, we all know how entrepreneurship works, right? It starts with the light bulb going off for some kind of child prodigy who invents something new that no one's ever thought of before. Or perhaps it's an MBA type who's conducted some kind of very keen market analysis and identified a hole. Either way, this protagonist writes a detailed business plan with lots of pretty charts and graphs and uses that business plan to raise huge amounts of venture capital. With all that cash in the bank, then the startup becomes kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. It achieves hockey stick-like growth, and then the hero kind of rides off into the sunset with the IPO, possibly retiring to a private island or maybe purchasing a professional sports team. So this is how entrepreneurship happens, right? It's very straightforward, it's very linear, and very wrong. With very rare exception, the entrepreneurial path actually looks very different than that. So to start, the average age of a first-time founder is about 40 years old. So the myth of the kind of college dropout turns out not to bear out very often in reality. Additionally, by the time we call a startup successful, it usually looks very different than the original kind of idea or inception that pushed it down the path of entrepreneurship to begin with. So the importance that we place on kind of the original idea turns out to be quite misplaced, actually. Less than 2% of ventures will ever raise venture capital. And if you look at the Inc. 500 as a set of successful startups that have ultimately become large businesses, very few of them have ever even had a business plan. Now, on top of all that, the mythical IPO, almost no startup will ever IPO, although there are many other ways that an entrepreneur might achieve startup success. So this kind of path has been somewhat mythologized by the media, but if this isn't how entrepreneurship usually works, then how does it work? And what can we learn from how it actually works to be more effective in pursuing our own entrepreneurial endeavors versus the conventional wisdom that tends to be more focused on this kind of highly mythologized and idealized path of entrepreneurship? I'm Brian Guido Hassan. I'm a Rice alum with degrees in computer science and electrical engineering. I also have an MBA from IMD Business School in Lausanne, Switzerland. And I've spent my career as a clean tech entrepreneur. Depending on how you count, I've launched between 4 and 7 clean tech startups and currently working on an energy efficiency technology venture called Smart Office Energy Solutions. But I'm also entrepreneur in residence at the Rice Center for Engineering Leadership, where I teach entrepreneurship and also help direct the OwlSpark Startup Accelerator at Rice. And what I'd like to do in this session is really address first kind of the basics of entrepreneurship, agree on some fundamental definitions so that we're speaking the same language. Then move into some exploration of entrepreneurial process, and specifically what's emerged recently under the heading of lean startup approach to entrepreneurship. And then finally wrap up with some rigorous academic research called effectuation that's recently emerged to tell us really what are the guiding principles that the most consistently successful entrepreneurs are using to increase their chances of success. So let's start with the basics. The very first and most fundamental question is, who is an entrepreneur? What is an entrepreneur? Often if we discuss this in class, many people will throw out lots of significant action verbs. Entrepreneurs are people who take risks, people who start something, people who innovate something, people who create something from nothing for big financial gain. But I'd like to challenge some of those notions and take a look at some of the edge cases to see if these people are entrepreneurs in your mind. So for example, Mike Yang owns a fast food franchise, right? So he didn't have any crazy new idea. He didn't really innovate anything, but he did take financial risk. And at the end of the day, he is responsible for the profit or loss of that business. Is Mike Yang an entrepreneur? Or what about these two gentlemen? In 1976, Eric Falk invented Nespresso while he was working for Nestle, a very large global corporation. He tried for years to commercialize it without success. But then later, along came Jean-Paul Gaillard, who took the Nespresso concept and turned it into the dominant multi-billion-dollar business that it is today. So which, if either of these, is an entrepreneur? Is it the person who came up with the original idea but failed to commercialize it? Or is it the person who didn't have an idea but was successful in commercializing it? Or is it neither of them because actually they were funded by Nestle, a very large corporation, as opposed to taking a whole lot of risk themselves? The white gentleman in the far back of this picture is Jesper Hornberg, a Swedish import to Kenya. Jesper started a non-profit organization called GiveWatts, which takes donations from around the world in units of watts of clean, renewable solar energy. He deploys these solar-powered lamps at off-grid schools and clinics in East Africa, where they reduce CO2 emissions by supplanting the burning of kerosene and biomass, where they increase health of the people around them because burning kerosene and biomass isn't creating noxious fumes anymore, and they actually increase the effectiveness of students studying because they're able to have light at night, as well as of doctors operating in clinics at night. So Jesper is bringing in resources through donations. He's deploying those resources through his deployment of solar-powered lamps, and he's scaling very quickly the organization and the impact that GiveWatts is having. But he's not making a profit. So is he an entrepreneur? And finally, let's look at Dan Eklund. Dan Eklund moved somewhere outside the United States, I can't remember if it was Mexico or the Caribbean somewhere, and started a clinic that promised to cure people of paralysis by using advanced stem cell research. Now, it turns out that it was a total fraud. He had no ability to cure anyone, but he made a lot of money. He took financial risk. He had an idea. He started something from scratch. So is Dan Eklund an entrepreneur? The point of these questions and edge cases is that often when we ask people to give us examples of entrepreneurs that they know of, we'll get Bill Gates and Steve Jobs and Mark Zuckerberg and people who are very prominent in the media. We like to think a little more holistically about entrepreneur, and especially around these edge cases. What does entrepreneurship mean to you? And there's a lot of debate you can have. There aren't necessarily right or wrong answers. But also when we ask people what entrepreneurs are like, what are the key traits that define entrepreneurs? Often they'll throw out, they're young, they're bold, charismatic, take risks, very smart and innovative. In short, they look kind of like this gentleman on the cover of Entrepreneur magazine. Although, to be clear, this guy is definitely a model and not an entrepreneur. But it turns out, if you look at real data, entrepreneurs, on average, look less like this guy and more like either the man or even the woman in this picture. As we said already, they're about 40 years old on average for the first time, married with children, and middle class, and with a bachelor's degree. Now, this often surprises people when they think that entrepreneurs have to have MBAs, but actually the plurality of first-time entrepreneurs have only bachelor's degrees, not advanced degrees. So while we're busting kind of myths of entrepreneurship, let's talk about a few more. One of the most prominent is that entrepreneurs don't really work for themselves. Many people idealize entrepreneurship because they want to be their own bosses. But entrepreneurs actually have many bosses. They have their investors, they have their clients, they may have regulators whom they're held accountable, or most importantly, their employees. There's no feeling of more crushing responsibility. And when you're lying awake at night as an entrepreneur, not quite sure if you're going to be able to pay your employees next week, employees who are depending on that salary, depending on it for themselves and for their families. So actually, entrepreneurs often have more sense of responsibility rather than less. Additionally, on average, if you take someone with the exact same, or two people with the exact same skill sets, and one starts down the path of entrepreneurship and the other starts climbing the corporate ladder, on average, the person climbing the corporate ladder will earn more over his career than the entrepreneur. So this somewhat busts the myth that entrepreneurship is all about making money. In fact, if you're going into entrepreneurship just to make money, then statistically, you're somewhat misguided. But entrepreneurs don't go into entrepreneurship because they believe in the law of averages, right? They believe that they can beat the statistics. That's what makes them entrepreneurs. So this myth busted isn't actually that applicable for would-be entrepreneurs. And here's what's most surprising to people who tend to view entrepreneurs as these kind of brazen risk takers. They've done numerous psychological studies on entrepreneurs and shown that, on average, an entrepreneur is actually slightly more risk averse than the population as a whole. Entrepreneurs tend just to frame risk differently and take much more calculated risks, which we'll discuss a little bit later on. So at Rice, we use the definition that entrepreneurship is a mindset, specifically about seeking solutions to problems, and then the activity of aligning resources to sustain and even scale up those solutions, but ultimately with the goal of creating value. We're not interested in the fraudulent kind of entrepreneurship. We're interested in something that creates financial and even social value. Now, there are 5 kind of canonical venture types, and this gets back to our discussion of the edge case. So a small business, like a fast food franchise, if you started up from scratch, that is a form of entrepreneurship. It's not going to be a billion-dollar business, but it might keep a few people employed and feed a family, for example. Large businesses can also be involved in entrepreneurship in 2 different ways. They can either sustain their kind of current path of innovation, making incremental changes to their product offering, or sometimes they can go for much more disruptive innovation and try radically new and different paths. Social enterprise social entrepreneurship doesn't have to be a non-profit. These can be for-profit ventures, but generally they're companies that they care about more than just the financial bottom line. They're also interested in other methods of accounting for success through social value creation. And then there's what we often think of as entrepreneurship, the scalable startup. This is something that has the capacity to grow very rapidly, create new markets or disrupt existing ones, and become a very significant, sizable venture, or possibly completely fail. And this is really our focus here at Rice, not only because the research coming out of labs at Rice is has so much potential to be that kind of scalable, disruptive power, but also just because the techniques that are necessary to build a scalable startup are so different from the techniques that are necessary to build a small or organically growing business, that this is a really interesting area of research and pedagogy. Steve Blank, who's a multiple-time entrepreneur himself and who teaches entrepreneurship at Berkeley and Stanford, has a good definition of entrepreneurship that I like, or of a startup. So a startup is a temporary organization used to search for a repeatable and scalable business model. So that's a couple of key words there. It's a temporary organization, right? It doesn't hope always to be a startup. It hopes ultimately to become a large business. If it wanted to stay small for the duration of its life, then it would be a small business, not a startup. But there's also something really important about the verb being used here. So large companies execute known business models. But it turns out that startups are not small versions of large companies. So startups are actually searching for unknown business models. It's a very important distinction because the techniques and methodologies and algorithms that you would use to execute something known are very different than those that you'd use to search for something unknown. So if we can agree now on kind of what entrepreneurship is and specifically what kind of scalable startups are, and that the techniques that we would use to build a scalable startup are somewhat specialized, let's now delve into kind of the entrepreneurial process for these scalable startups. So for decades, we've thought of the entrepreneurial process as essentially the same way that large businesses launch new initiatives. So it starts with a business plan. Someone who has an idea might spend months writing a 30, 40, 50-page business plan. Lots of market research, lots of detailed forecasts and calculations. And eventually, once this business plan is so pretty and so beautiful, we'll then take that out to venture capitalists to raise money to execute that business plan. Raising venture capital on average takes maybe 6 months, but it could take longer. So let's say after a year, finally the person has the plan and the person has the capital, the resources in order to execute the plan. So the entrepreneur hires up a big engineering staff and starts actually building the product that is called for in the plan. Now, as a recovering engineer, I can attest that often we engineers will take longer to build products than we think we will up front. So it might take a couple of years to build this product, may require going back and raising another round of venture capital because we ran out of money the first time. But eventually, let's say after 3 years or so, we've got the plan in place and we finally have the product that the plan calls for. Now we take it out to the market and try to sell it. But as Steve Blank is often fond of saying, no business plan ever survives first contact with the customer. Perhaps we made some assumptions in the business plan that just turned out not to be right, and now finally we're realizing that. Or perhaps all of our assumptions were right 3 years ago, but things change, and every year that goes by, things change much more quickly than the previous year. And so 3 years is an eternity, actually, to be sitting on something and building something. So what we need is a much more agile approach. Something with which we can capture the same information of a business plan, but get to market much more quickly so that we can start engaging customers, start capturing their feedback and using that, integrating that into our development process. So a tool that has emerged recently is called a business model canvas. And this has 9 different components, which it uses to capture the same information that you would capture in a business plan, but does so in a much more lightweight, agile, and easily modifiable way. One of the important kind of key mantras of the lean startup approach, though, is to recognize that what you put down in this business model canvas is just a guess. It's a hypothesis. And so the lean startup approach, or specifically the first part of it, which we call customer development, involves rapid iterations of essentially the scientific method, designing specific tests to test each of your hypotheses and going out very cheaply and quickly to conduct those tests and capturing data and integrating that data, whether your hypotheses were validated or refuted, kind of back into the business model that you're developing. So this is called customer development, rapid iterations of this cycle. Now the key mantra of customer development is to get out of the building. You can't develop customers sitting safely behind your computer and hacking away on spreadsheets or writing source code for a product that you're not sure that anyone actually wants. So you have to get out of the building and talk with customers. And it's important that this be done by the founders, not by a consultant whom you hire, something to that effect. Because there's very tacit knowledge that you get from really interacting with customers. Now, when you go out and try to validate your hypotheses, often, unfortunately, the results come back negative. You had a hypothesis that this was your target customer and this was the value proposition that would work for that customer, and that this was the channel that you would use to convince that customer that your value proposition was valid, and it turns out that that's just not the case. So when that happens, you take that information back to your business model, and specifically your business model canvas, and you kind of update your hypotheses. And often when you update one, it has kind of a ripple effect, and you have to update a couple of others. So for example, if you originally thought that you were going to be in a very low price, high volume type of market, and then you found out that actually the real opportunity is to be a high-end, high-price luxury good, that will have significant implications probably on the channels that you use to market, on your value proposition, on your product, and certainly on your cost basis. So this is okay. This is built into the customer development process, and it's referred to as the pivot. Pivoting is great because it gets you closer to having a sustainable, scalable business model. And after several of these iterations, several of these cycles in which you've gone out to validate your hypotheses with customers and come back and probably pivoted somewhat, your goal to exit, kind of break out of this loop, is called the MVP, the minimum viable product. In contrast to the way we used to think of product development, which is that you had to write a huge specification and build everything with all the bells and whistles first and then take it out to the customer, the notion of the minimum viable product is essentially the opposite. What is the least, kind of smallest, fastest to develop, cheapest to produce feature set that you need really to get out there and start selling to customers, or at least getting in front of customers and getting kind of real user feedback? This approach of going with a minimum viable product allows you to start capturing that feedback and integrating customers into your development cycle much earlier, much more cheaply, and much more quickly. So this sounds easy, right? There was a very simple flow chart there that even non-engineers could follow pretty effectively, and yet we still hear so much about the massive failure rate of entrepreneurs. And it turns out that entrepreneurship is actually still pretty hard. It's pretty complex. There's very large or almost infinite solution space in the problem of entrepreneurship. So the search is tough. But there's some new research called effectuation, which is done collaborative research through several different universities, in which they've really looked at multiple times successful entrepreneurs and a significant body of them, and actually distilled out some commonalities in the approaches that all of these entrepreneurs are taking. So now I'd like to focus on the principles of effectuation and things you can do that will generally kind of increase chances of success in entrepreneurship. So one of the most significant has to do with just kind of an overall approach toward arriving at an end. So the traditional, call it kind of big corporate approach, or even the academic approach, is to start with a predefined goal and then align the resources that you need to achieve that goal. So you kind of fix the end and then gather the means to achieve that end. Now that works very well in highly predictable environments, in mature markets, with existing customers and existing products. But unfortunately, that's not the environment in which entrepreneurs operate. Entrepreneurs operate in the opposite, highly unpredictable environments. And so the most successful entrepreneurs essentially invert this process. They start with their own means, so who they are, whom they know, what they know, and then they create new opportunities, new ends that are based on this unique combination of means. Moreover, the best entrepreneurs excel at attracting partners who have additional means. And when they combine their two sets of means, they're able to envision even new ends that weren't even possible before, which turns out to be extremely important for entrepreneurs. Moreover, in the highly unpredictable world of entrepreneurship, it's not a question of if you will achieve surprise, or you will have surprises, but really when you will have surprises. In the traditional kind of business plan approach, you didn't like surprises because surprises meant you had to go back and rewrite your 40-page business plan. But the best entrepreneurs not only embrace surprises, but they find ways to leverage them. They might meet someone new who turns out to be an excellent partner, and they can somewhat pivot their business and create new ends based on the means that that partner brings. They might learn something new that actually somewhat upsets their previous worldview, but that's something that they know now and their competitors don't know, which gives them competitive advantage if they can use it. Now back to the notion of risk in entrepreneurs. So in the effectuation research, they've done a lot of research about how entrepreneurs kind of think and behave versus corporate managers or financiers and bankers. And so if you take someone in the kind of larger corporate world, they will tend to set a desired return up front. I want to earn 10% on the capital that I'm investing. And then they'll do everything they can to reduce the risk that they won't achieve that goal of a return. So through hedging investments, for example, or buying insurance. Entrepreneurs, once again, do essentially the opposite. So entrepreneurs set their maximum affordable loss, they set a boundary on how much they're willing to risk, but within that constraint, they do everything they can actually to increase returns. So a very different way of viewing risk, not whether something is risky or not, but as long as it's not beyond a certain point of loss, then it's tolerant for entrepreneurs. And so once again on the business plan side, so plans by their very nature are effective tools in predictable environments. If you can predict the future, you can use causal logic. And so that's what a plan is. If I do A, B, and C, then I will achieve X, Y, and Z, and it's not very risky. But entrepreneurship is not in a predictable environment, certainly not startup entrepreneurship, when you're creating new markets or disrupting existing markets. So there we have to use effectual logic instead. We place much less emphasis on our ability to predict the future and much more on our ability to control the future. So the metaphor that I like to use is that of a hot air balloon. Bertrand Piccard several years ago was the first person to circumnavigate the Earth in a hot air balloon. And no matter how good your computers are, you can't control the weather. You can't even predict the weather, not for that duration over that long distance. But you can control the altitude of the balloon. So if you find yourself in an area where the wind is blowing in the wrong direction, it's not taking you towards your goal, you can maybe go lower and see if the wind is blowing in the right direction there. Or if you run into a storm, you might be able to go higher and actually go over the storm. So this is a very important concept in effectuation, this notion of controlling the future versus trying to predict it, because at the end of the day, it's very, very unpredictable. And so we like to think of this almost as a game, to illustrate the concept, a game of picking marbles out of a glass jar. So if you win the game by selecting a red marble, there are 3 jars in front of you. The first is very predictable. It's a transparent jar, so you can see from the outside what the distribution of red marbles versus green marbles are. So you know kind of what your chances are of being able to kind of pick out a red marble, and you can adjust your strategy accordingly. The second jar is somewhat risky. It's an opaque jar. You know that it has just red and green marbles, but you don't know in advance what the distribution of those marbles is. But by selecting several marbles out of that jar, you can probably estimate with pretty good accuracy what the distribution is of the rest of the marbles in those jars. So you can kind of adjust your strategy then accordingly as well. Now the third jar, though, is just a total black box. You don't know what's in it, and every time you pick a marble out, it doesn't help you predict any better than the previous marble what the rest of the distribution of marbles are. And so entrepreneurship is really dealing with this third jar. Once again, the solution space is so large in entrepreneurship, not only to be unknown, but literally unknowable. So it's pretty clear what strategies we might use to kind of win the game, or at least increase our chances for the first 2 jars. But how do the most effective entrepreneurs deal with the third jar? Well, to start, expert entrepreneurs will add as many red marbles as they can to that third jar. So they're not going to rely on just trying to predict what's in there. They're actually going to stuff the ballot box, in essence. And additionally, they'll find friends who have red marbles and say, hey, come be my partner and stick your red jars in there as well. So that they dramatically increase their chances of pulling a red marble out when they stick their hand in the jar. Or, if this doesn't work, if they just don't have red marbles and they can't find friends who have red marbles, they'll create a new game. And if they have blue marbles, the new game will be one in which you win, in which you pull out a blue marble. So once again, really taking control of their own destiny, rather than fatalistically trying to sit back and just make the best decision of what they think they know out there. Now, a final note on innovation. This is actually somewhat outside the effectuation research, but I think it's very important. When we think of innovation and entrepreneurship, we always tend to think of a product, right? Some new product that solves some new fancy need. But actually, there are many other types of innovation as well, kind of around the product. There's the financing, the actual business model or the way that you charge a customer for access to that product. There's the process that you use actually to build that product. And then there's the kind of the delivery. What channels are you using? What's your brand like with the customer, et cetera. So kind of the marketing element of the product. And so each of these offers an opportunity for innovation. Now, historically, the vast majority of innovation is going toward the product, as you can see on this graph. I mean, the others altogether maybe add up to the same amount of innovation. But if you look at the amount of value being created by innovation, the least is being created by product innovation. Actually, the most is in these more kind of ancillary areas of innovation. So if you think of these different areas of innovation as keys on a piano, and the middle C is innovation on the product. It's actually other keys in that octave that really provide more value, but the best innovation really is made by playing chords across each of these areas. So something that integrates innovation in finance, process, the product, and delivery all together in a way that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And when we ask people for examples of companies that have been particularly successful with that kind of innovation, 99 times out of 100, Apple is the first one to come out. So when we look at 10 years ago now, when they came out with the iPod, the iPod was sort of innovative as a product. I mean, the product itself, the portable MP3 player, was not innovative. The design and the user interface was. What made this enormously successful was the fact that it wasn't just the iPod, but also iTunes, a new way of procuring music. Apple locked up supply on a certain kind of flash memory such that no one could actually compete with them and build as small or as sexy a device for a year and a half after the iPod launch, which gave them a huge head start. And of course, the delivery with Apple was totally different. They actually created their own retail store, which had a very different customer experience than people who were previously buying things online at kind of nerdy websites like newegg.com. So Apple, by playing these chords across the innovation piano, was able completely to transform an industry. And of course, has continued to do that then with the iPhone and the iPad. And that creates significant competitive advantage, as illustrated by the massive amounts of cash that is sitting in Apple's bank accounts right now. So I'd like you to think about these effectuation principles. Think about what are your means, who you are, whom you know, and what you know, and how could you combine those combination of means to create some new opportunity that no one else would really be able to pursue. When it comes to entrepreneurship, what is your affordable loss? Don't think about it so much in terms of kind of cost benefit or the net present value of making a decision, but actually how much could you lose, whether in terms of financial loss or opportunity cost, or in terms even of just kind of psychological loss if something were to be a big failure. What's your maximum downside? And if you set that barrier, you might have the ability to take some much bigger shots. And what can you do really to control the future instead of predict it? When people are kind of looking to take the entrepreneurial plunge, often they're trying to make bets on the right team or the right product or the right idea. But once again, the idea, especially at the initial outset of entrepreneurship, tends to have very little bearing on the ultimate success of the company. And success comes from the ability actually to control and shape that future. And then outside of just the product itself, what are the other areas of innovation that you could pursue in order to support product innovation or even completely supplant it? All right, this has been, Entrepreneurship 101, a very brief overview of fundamentals of entrepreneurship, lean startup methodology and entrepreneurial process, and then the principles of effectuation research.